everyone. Welcome back. Ready to dive into some serious history with me today.
Always up for a good deep dive.
All right, so we're tackling a story that, it has had a huge impact, and we're doing it just for you. It's the 1953 coup in Iran. Talk about a political thriller. Cold War paranoia, oil, and some serious consequences we're still dealing with today.
Yeah, it's a story that really shaped the relationship between the U.S. and Iran for decades.
And to guide us through this, we've got the YouTube documentary, How the U.S. Turned Iran into a Dictatorship from Real-Time History. Kind of a loaded title, right?
You say that again.
But before we get into all that, let's set the scene. It's the early 1950s. Iran is struggling to, control its own oil wealth. And of course, we've got those Cold War tensions brewing.
Oh, absolutely. It's a recipe for, conflict, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got these global power plays clashing with internal political struggle.
Yeah, so much happening at once. So remind us about the political landscape in Iran at that time.
Okay, so picture this. You have Reza Shah Pahlavi pushing for modernization. But at the same time, there's this heavy influence from both Britain and the Soviet Union.
Right, Iran's stuck in the middle.
Exactly. Then his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, he takes over, and things, they don't exactly get smoother.
And the people, were they happy with all this?
Well, there was growing resentment, that's for sure. I mean, imagine seeing your own country's wealth controlled by outsiders.
Yeah.
Many Iranians were struggling while this oil money was flowing out.
Right, so that resentment is simmering. And then enters Mohammad Mossadegh.
Ah, Mossadegh, a charismatic leader, becomes prime minister in 1951, and then boom, he drops this bombshell nationalization of Iran's oil industry.
Now, I know nationalizing industries was like a thing back then, but why was the West so freaked out by this move? Wasn't that a totally legal thing for a country to do?
Yeah, good question. See, Mossadegh was all about Iran first, fiercely nationalist. He basically said, Iran's oil, it belongs to Iranians, end of story.
So he was standing up for his people, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He was seen as a hero by many Iranians. There's even this quote from him in the documentary. Hold on, let me find it. Okay, here we go. Thanks to the nationalization of the British company, we can combat corruption in our country. Our oil profits will enable us to fight poverty, sickness, and underdevelopment. Powerful stuff.
Wow, yeah. He wasn't messing around. But okay, so it ruffled some feathers in the West, that's clear. Was it just about the oil, though? Or was something else going on?
It was a combo platter, losing control of Iranian oil. Huge blow to British and Western interests.
Yeah.
But then you've got the Cold War paranoia in the mix. The U.S. was terrified of communism spreading.
Right.
They saw Mossadegh's policies, his nationalism, as a potential opening, for Soviet influence, like a backdoor to the Middle East.
Okay, so that fear of communism, it was driving U.S. policy big time. But how far were they willing to go to stop it? I mean, were they really willing to meddle in another country's business just because of this fear?
Oh, absolutely. The fear was that strong. Eisenhower even said, and this is straight from the documentary, that Iran was on a downhill course toward communist-supported dictatorship.
So you have the British fuming about the oil and the U.S. panicking about communism. What happened next? Did they, get together and say, let's take Mossadegh out?
It wasn't quite that blunt, but yeah, that's basically what went down. The British really pushed the U.S. to act, playing up the whole communist threat thing. And that leads us to Operation Ajax.
Operation Ajax. Sounds like something straight out of a spy movie.
Right. It was a joint operation of the CIA and MI6.
No.
The goal, overthrow Mossadegh and put the Shah back in charge, figuring he'd be a little more cooperative.
So they cook up this plan, but how did they actually do it? Did they send in troops, full-blown invasion?
No, much more subtle than that. Think propaganda, bribery, playing on existing divisions within Iran.
Ah, classic spy stuff.
Exactly. They funded pro-Shah demonstrations, spread rumors to make Mossadegh look bad, even bribed people in the government and military to turn against him.
Wow. Talk about a tangled web. So this elaborate plan, did it go smoothly?
Well, about that, things get interesting and messy when they actually try to get rid of Mossadegh. The first attempt, in August 1953, it fails. Utter chaos. The Shah, he actually flees the country. Can you imagine? Talk about a PR nightmare.
Yeah, things must have been pretty tense in Tehran. The documentary even mentions conflicting reports coming out, rumors swirling that Mossadegh was, building gallows. Yikes.
Seriously, it seemed like the whole operation was about to blow up in their faces.
Talk about a stressful business trip for Kermit Roosevelt, the CIA agent running the show. So what happened? Did they just pack it in and call it a day?
No. Roosevelt, he was a determined guy. Remember, the stakes were high for both the U.S. and Britain. They regroup, launch a second attempt. And how this second coup got rolling, well, it's still a bit of a mystery, even today.
Ooh, love a good mystery. So spill it. What went down in round two?
This time, they get their man. Pro-Shah forces, with a little help from the CIA's cash and some covert support, take control. Mossadegh, he gets arrested. And the Shah, he makes his triumphant return to Iran, ready to solidify his power.
So the Shah's back, thanks to a CIA operation. Must have been quite the meeting when he finally met Roosevelt. Did they, like, high five or something?
That was that casual.
Yeah.
But the documentary actually quotes the Shah saying this to Roosevelt: "I owe my throne to God, to my people, my army, and to you." Kind of sums it up, doesn't it?
Yeah, pretty loaded statement. So mission accomplished for the U.S. and the British. Mossadegh's out, Shah's in, the oil's flowing again. Everyone's happy, right?
Oh, if only it were that simple. That's where the whole unintended consequences thing rears its ugly head. Installing the Shah. Well, it didn't exactly lead to stability, actually created a whole new set of problems. For Iran, for the U.S., for the region as a whole.
You're saying the whole operation backfired. How so?
The Shah, he becomes increasingly authoritarian, cracks down on any opposition, silences any dissent. He even creates this infamous secret police force, the Savak.
The Savak. I've heard that name before. What was so bad about them?
Think widespread torture, imprisonment, even executions, for anyone suspected of opposing the Shah, a reign of terror for decades.
Hold on, let me get this straight. The U.S. trying to stop a communist takeover, they actually helped install a dictator who was just as bad. That's wow.
Yeah, it's a tragic irony. Instead of safeguarding Western interests, this coup ends up destabilizing Iran, fuels resentment toward the West, especially the U.S. Basically, it planted the seeds for the Islamic Revolution that happened just a couple of decades later.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. What about the rest of the world? Did other countries just sit back and watch all this go down?
Oh, this sent shockwaves through the Middle East and beyond. Intensified the Cold War rivalry, the Soviets used it to point fingers at American imperialism. For a lot of newly independent nations, it was like a slap in the face, proof that the West would meddle wherever they wanted to get their way.
Yeah, I bet that wasn't a good look for the U.S. on the international stage.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Really damaged America's reputation, especially for those in the developing world. Reinforced that image of the U.S. as a bully, ready to topple governments they didn't like.
It's wild to think that all this went down because of a fear of communism and the desire to control oil. Makes you wonder, what if the U.S. had taken a different approach? What if they hadn't been so quick to intervene? Could things have turned out differently?
As the question historians still debate. What if they'd supported Mossadegh? Helped him make Iran's democracy stronger? Let them choose their own path? Would it have prevented the Shah's authoritarianism, the revolution? We'll never know for sure, but it's a good thought experiment. Shows how complicated history is, all those unintended consequences.
It really does make you think. So this whole coup, pretty dark chapter in U.S.-Iran relations, did things ever get better?
Well, that's a whole other story, isn't it? But this coup cast a long shadow, mistrust and animosity for decades. Remember, it took over 50 years for the U.S. to officially admit they were involved in the 1953 coup.
50 years. That's a long time to keep a secret. It really highlights the impact of this event, shaping those two countries' relationships for generations.
It shows how deeply ingrained it became in their collective memory, both for Iranians and Americans. A wound that, even today, hasn't completely healed.
This has been an eye-opener. It makes you realize the importance of understanding history, not just dates and names, but how these events connect and shape the world. The documentary also touches on how this 1953 coup influenced the U.S.'s foreign policy after. Did it change how they approached intervening in other countries?
Oh, absolutely. They saw Operation AX as a success, at least in the short term, and it emboldened them to engage in similar covert operations in other parts of the world. You see it in Guatemala, Indonesia, even the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, like a domino effect. Each intervention justified by that Cold War logic, containing communism, whatever the cost.
So they're basically thinking, we did it in Iran, let's try it again somewhere else. It's a bit unsettling to think that this one event had such a ripple effect across the world. Let's shift gears a bit. The documentary also looks at the people involved in all this. We've talked about Mossadegh, the Shah, Kermit Roosevelt. Were there any other major figures in this whole thing?
Oh, tons of players on both sides, each with their own reasons, their own goals. On the Iranian side, you have General Fazlollah Zahedi, who became prime minister after the coup, staunchly anti-communist, close ally of the Shah, so he was crucial in consolidating power after Mossadegh's gone.
So he was kind of like the Shah's right-hand man in all of this.
Yeah, you could say that. He helped rally support for the Shah within the military, helped squash any remaining opposition to the new regime.
Fascinating. Sounds like a powerful guy. It's interesting how the documentary focuses on these individuals, but is it really all about these key players making deals behind closed doors? Or were there bigger forces at play, like you mentioned earlier, the Cold War, the oil interests?
That's a great point. It's never just about individuals, is it?
Yeah.
Got to remember the bigger picture. The Cold War was this huge ideological struggle shaping global politics for decades. Then you've got the competition over resources, oil especially, adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing. These larger forces created the perfect conditions for this coup to happen, and they definitely influenced how people like the Shah, Mossadegh, even Roosevelt made their decisions.
So it's this intricate dance between what individuals do and these larger historical forces that shape events, like untangling a giant knot. Speaking of knots, I have to ask about the oil. We've talked about it as a motivating factor, but the documentary really emphasizes its role. Just how important was oil in all of this?
Oh, oil was absolutely central. Controlling Iran's vast oil reserves was a huge factor driving both British and American interests in the region. The documentary really shows how economic concerns were often tied up with political and ideological motives. It's hard to separate them completely.
So it all comes down to follow the money. Oil was the prize. And it seems like wanting to control those reserves really shaped the course of events.
Exactly. And it's something we should always keep in mind when we're trying to understand international relations. Economic interests, they often drive political decisions, even when those decisions are disguised in fancy ideological rhetoric.
Okay, so to recap, the 1953 coup in Iran was this turning point, driven by a mix of Cold War anxieties, the desire for oil, and the beliefs that the U.S. had the right, the duty even, to reshape the world to fit their vision. A cautionary tale about those unintended consequences, underestimating local dynamics, and the lasting impact of decisions made for so-called national interest.
Well put. Makes you think. Huh. What if the U.S. had taken a less interventionist approach? How different would things be?
And that brings us to maybe the most crucial question. What can we learn from the 1953 coup? How can we apply those lessons to understand what's happening in the world today, the challenges we face now?
Those are the big questions, and ones we'll need to grapple with as we continue to explore this complicated and fascinating story.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. The context, the coup itself, those ripple effects that are still being felt. But what does it all mean for us, sitting here, now?
That's the key question, isn't it? I
Right.
think we could take a step back. The 1953 coup, it's like this giant warning sign about messing with other countries' destinies, those unexpected consequences that can come back and bite you.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the headlines, the feeling that you have to act quickly. But this deep dive really shows the importance of the long game, how our choices play out over time, years, even decades.
Exactly. And it underscores why we need to understand history, not just as a bunch of events, but as this intricate web of forces and decisions.
Mhm.
We can't treat the past like it's some isolated thing. Everything's connected.
And especially now, right, in the 21st century with all the geopolitical stuff going on, learning from history feels more important than ever.
Absolutely. We have to recognize those patterns, those tendencies, the potential pitfalls that history reveals.
Yeah.
And when it comes to foreign policy, a little humility goes a long way. Remembering that our actions can have consequences far beyond what we intended.
So, knowing what we know now about how the 1953 coup played out, could it have been prevented?
Now there's the million-dollar question. Tough one. No easy answers. But it's a question worth asking. Maybe a different approach. One focused on diplomacy, genuine engagement, instead of those covert operations. Maybe that could have led to a different outcome. Or maybe those Cold War forces, they were just too powerful to overcome.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? It forces us to imagine other paths, question the assumptions that often drive decision-making back then and even now.
Exactly. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not about memorizing facts and figures. It's about wrestling with these tough questions, challenging our own views, and ultimately becoming more informed, more engaged citizens.
Well said. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. It's a reminder that history isn't some fixed thing. It's a conversation that we're all part of.
And by continuing to explore the past, to learn from it, hopefully we can gain insights to help us navigate the present and work toward a future that's more peaceful, more just.
I couldn't agree more. And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive into the 1953 coup in Iran as thought-provoking as we did. It's a complex event, full of controversy, and its impact on the relationship between the U.S. and Iran is still being felt today.
As you continue to learn about this, here's something to consider. Knowing what we know now, could the 1953 coup have been prevented? And if so, how? What lessons can we take from this piece of history to better understand current events, how foreign policy decisions are made? It's a lot to ponder.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another exploration of history and its relevance to our world today.